It finally happened. Albo has become so unpopular that he's been booed at a sporting event. This happened at the Australian Open recently.
On behalf of Tennis Australia, I'd like to welcome Victorian Governor, Her Excellency, the Honourable Professor Margaret Gardner, the Australian Prime Minister, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, the Deputy Victorian Premier, the Honourable Ben Carroll. Thank you.
Now the booing was loud, sustained and pronounced, and it wasn't just a couple of one or two random people shouting out. It seemed to be a lot of the crowd, drowning out any of Anthony Albanese's potential supporters, if indeed there were any. Anthony Albanese appears to be on the nose. Now the booing coincided with two major things. First, it coincided with Anthony Albanese hiking taxes on higher income earners. And second, it coincided with Australia Day, which Anthony Albanese had slightly equivocated about. So let's go through why the crowd was booing Anthony Albanese and see whether it was really warranted. And let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. So let's start with the tax hikes. Anthony Albanese announced tax hikes on higher income earners. He did this by backflipping on the Stage 3 tax cuts, which Anthony Albanese had previously promised in full, a promise he had reiterated over 100 times. Now let's make no mistake about this. There were previously legislated tax cuts. By reversing those tax cuts, that effectively is a tax hike on the impacted people, because those tax cuts already were law. They're just not started quite yet, and therefore reversing them is in fact a tax hike. The fact that Anthony Albanese had promised to deliver the tax cuts in full means that Anthony Albanese lied and misled to the public. This isn't a case where he just minorly tweaked a policy. This is going to require new legislation he will need to get through the House of Representatives and the Senate. It is a whole-scale change, and it is a tax hike. Now, those tax cuts that would have gone to higher income earners were actually reasonably minor, given the impact of inflation, and given the fact that they would have been adjusting the tax brackets at which the highest marginal tax rate would apply. Because the thing is, those income tax brackets or thresholds hadn't been raised since the mid-2000s, meaning that if they were raised just purely due to inflation, they would have been raised to $270,000, as opposed to the $190,000 under Labor's plan or the $200,000 under the previously legislated changes. The top rate is kicking in earlier and earlier in real or inflation-adjusted terms, something that has been decried in the media. Notably, for example, the United States' top marginal tax rate is 37% at the federal level, and that only applies to incomes above $609,000. So not only is the top marginal tax rate lower than in Australia, it applies at a higher level of income. Albo, therefore, has locked Australians into a situation where the government seizes ever more of their income, as inflation forces those incomes higher, and eventually it means that that $190,000 is going to a very average wage, not a wage that applies to just high income earners, but a wage that applies more generally, if only due to inflation. Now, Anthony Albanese has tried to message this. He's tried to spin this tax hike, and he's spun it by saying he's giving a tax cut to everyone, ranging from lower income earners through to higher income earners. However, one can see through this, because firstly, as indicated, this is in fact a tax hike on those higher income earners, because it is reversing a previous tax cut. Second, for the lower income earners, it is in fact a tax cut, but there are some issues if we dig a little bit deeper. First, Anthony Albanese has baked in bracket creep because he isn't indexing those thresholds to inflation. But there is a more fundamental problem. The irony is that Anthony Albanese is happy to throw high income earners under the bus, but is pretending that this is fine because the majority of Australians are better off. But what exactly is the limiting principle? When is it okay to trash a minority and when is it not? Because Anthony Albanese's logic here seems to be that if you are a minority and you can take the assets from the minority to benefit the majority, then it's perfectly okay to do so. But which minorities can be sacrificed and which minorities cannot be? There isn't a clear principle underlying Anthony Albanese's logic. His logic appears to be that if you're a minority, the majority can just seize your assets because it benefits more people. However, that is dangerous logic, because it means the government could in theory just nationalise your house to benefit the rest of Australians, or put power lines through your house, or sewage lines through your house. It means the government can do whatever it wants as long as it benefits more people than you. That is, your assets cease to become really your assets, and the government can do whatever it wants with them. And this is dangerous, because it really is going down to that you will own nothing and be happy type rhetoric that we have seen. It is a major issue, because Anthony Albanese's logic, when extended to its natural conclusion, means that the government can run roughshod over anyone. This time it's higher income earners, but next time it might not be. Next time it might just be a random person that is in the way of a power line, or a random person that's in the way of a renewable energy project, someone who is in the way of what the government wants to do that they deem to be benefiting the majority. Therefore, the government can just seize private property if it believes that is beneficial. That is the logical conclusion of what Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers want to do. It is a huge problem. It means they can run roughshod over minority groups so long as they can pretend that a majority benefits. However, under that principle, we all lose out. Under that principle, we could all be in the firing line. Under that principle, anyone can be attacked at any point, because all it takes is for the government to deem you to be a politically expendable minority that they can attack to benefit themselves, and to supposedly benefit a majority who could then ultimately in the future become in the firing line themselves. Anthony Albanese has set up a very dangerous precedent. A minority group can be attacked and their assets just taken or stolen or dealt with in the manner the government wants, just because those assets can be redistributed to a larger group of people. It is Socialism 101, just slathered with a thin veneer of egalitarianism. But we can all see through Anthony Albanese's hollow rhetoric. We can all see through exactly where this is going to lead. We can all see through the fact that Anthony Albanese's limiting principle simply doesn't exist. Then you've got the idea that Anthony Albanese has broken a promise. Now, many people have said that they don't really care that much because they're benefiting this time. They're benefiting from the broken promise, and it supposedly makes the tax cuts fairer for everyone. Well, I've already addressed the fairness issue. As I've indicated, if you were just attacking minorities in order to benefit a supposed majority, that is hardly fair, and where does that stop? And in the future, that person that is benefiting now could be hit in the future, and they themselves could be harmed. It is a very dangerous precedent, and it is dangerous and short-sighted to just think about it in this one incident. You need to think about what that means for the future. Not only that, if Anthony Albanese is willing to discard this promise, what about the promises you actually benefit from, or the promises you care about? Anthony Albanese might have made promises to you that you want him to keep. But do you trust him to keep them? When do you trust him to keep them? What does his word actually mean? He's broken this promise, and he broke it to a politically expedient constituency. But what about the next promise? What about the time when you're no longer politically useful? What about the time when it is politically useful to break a promise to you in order to benefit someone else? That is a major problem. And people really need to wonder, how much is Anthony Albanese's word worth? And do they trust him when Anthony Albanese says in the future that he's going to benefit them? Because actions speak louder than words. And Anthony's words are easily discarded, and his actions go against what he has promised to do. The second issue that was contemporaneous with all of this booing was, of course, Australia Day. Now, Australia Day, as always, is supposedly controversial, as told to us by Woolworths. The problem here is that Anthony Albanese has become associated with the equivocation around Australia Day. His strident support for the voice and his failure to effectively and clearly and articulately support Australia Day effectively means he appears to be out of step with most Australians. Most Australians want to support Australia Day, at least according to recent polling from Roy Morgan. However, Anthony Albanese appears to want to sidestep things. He appears to not want to enter the debate. He appears to not actually really want to support Australia Day, but he doesn't really want to actually outright offend anyone. Anthony Albanese hasn't been strong enough in his support for Australia Day. He stands in stark contrast to people like Chris Minns or Peter Dutton in this respect. People are suspicious that Anthony Albanese, deep down, wants to change the date of Australia Day, and that he is only paying lip service to the day. This much is clear from when he decided to not follow Chris Minns' lead in calling out the sports codes to celebrate Australia Day. Anthony Albanese appears to not really believe in the day. At least that's the inference one can draw from some of his statements. He simply hasn't been strident enough in his support. Notably, as I've indicated, the vast majority of Australians are happy with Australia Day being called such, and do not support moving the date, at least according to recent polling from Roy Morgan, and support for Australia Day has only increased. Therefore, when we look at all of these factors, Australians are losing patience with Anthony Albanese, and he is now being booed. He's being booed because his word means nothing. He's being booed because people can see that he's willing to attack minorities when it is politically expedient to do so. This time it's higher income owners, but next time it might be them. And if he's willing to break a promise, and this time it was to higher income owners, will he break a promise to you in the future? People simply don't trust Anthony Albanese, which is notable, and even if prior administrations and prior leaders had been untrustworthy. Is it really good enough for Anthony Albanese to fall back on that bad standard? Or should we actually be trying to demand higher standards of politicians, especially when they have repeatedly promised to do a particular thing and then do the opposite? And in the case, let me know your thoughts about Anthony Albanese being booed in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.